Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today we'll continue with our second section, which was about theories and hypotheses of second language learning. And today we'll talk about monitor model, or the Stephen Christian monitor model. But as always, let's take our quiz, which is about error analysis and universal grammar. So, what is the other source of errors that error analysis suggested? We said that the first source of errors was interference, and we said that there is other source. What's that source? Also, what is the name of the learner's language? There's a term that was given to this system, and the actual use of language is called. We talked about two terms. One of them was about what we know about the language, and the other was the actual use of the language. And finally, which hypothesis said that there are other mental processes other than UG? We took three hypotheses about universal grammar and second language learning. And one of them said that there are other mental processes other than UG that can explain second language learning. So let's start with our video for today, which is monitor model, or another name for it, input hypothesis. So Stephen Christian came up with five hypotheses. They are interrelated, but each one of them, we'll talk about them separately. And actually, each one of his hypotheses was criticized. So we'll talk about the hypothesis itself and the criticism. So the first one is acquisition learning hypothesis, then the monitor model, that's the name, monitor model hypothesis, natural order hypothesis, comprehensible input hypothesis, and finally affective filter hypothesis. So acquisition learning hypothesis. So this hypothesis said that there are two ways in which learner gain competence. There is the acquisition and learning. So the acquisition is acquired through subconscious exposure to language, while the learning is conscious exposure to language data. So the acquisition is subconscious. We are not aware that we are we are not aware while exposing to the language. We're exposed to the language, but learning is conscious. Like, we are conscious that we are exposed to the language and we want to learn the language. The second one is the learner engages in communicative exchanges and not consciously focused on language features. Like the first one is subconscious, it's not conscious, and tend to occur in naturalistic situation. It's like natural, like daily conversation and things like that. But the learning is in typical language classrooms. Also, learners are taught the language through grammar and vocabulary exercises, like how we learn the language in schools, in universities, in language teaching centers. That's the learning, which is conscious. We learn grammar, vocabulary, and something like that. And then Kirsten said that what is learned cannot be acquired. Like, the thing that we learned can never be something that is acquired. It's not can't be something that is subconscious. It will always be conscious knowledge. But as I said, it was criticized. So it was pointed out that Christian offers no proof to support his hypothesis. So even though he came up with this hypothesis, he didn't offer proof to support it. Also, it didn't offer a clear way of distinguishing learned from acquired knowledge. So if I have all this knowledge or competence, how can I determine if I learned or acquired it? So he didn't offer a clear way to distinguish these terms. Then let's have our second hypothesis, which is monitor model. So as I said, there's two systems, which is acquisition and learning, and that the learning system acts as a monitor or editor to the acquired system. So the monitor model says that the learning system, which is learning, acts as a monitor to the acquired system. So the monitor was stated to function like an editor, in that it could allow the learner to correct their utterances under certain specific conditions. So, like, I learned a specific grammatical rule, I learned it, so it acts as a monitor, so it edits how I use this, how I use the language. But this editor, we can use it under specific conditions. So first of all, focusing on the form of the utterance, like we have to focus on the form, the structure of the utterance, like we are saying. Also, having sufficient time to use the monitor. So we need to have sufficient time, a lot of time, to use this monitor. And finally, knowing the relevant grammatical rule to correct the utterance. We need to know the grammatical rule, like how we can correct the utterance without knowing the grammatical rule or learning it. But also, it was criticized. So Christian again offered no real evidence that such a device or learning entity actually exists. So there is no evidence again. It is impossible to determine whether rules are conscious or not. Like the first criticism about the acquisition learning, we can't determine or distinguish whether the rules are conscious or not. They are learned or acquired. So there is no way to determine between these two things. And there is one study that found no support for the necessity of time condition once a focus on form was taken into account. So he said that the time condition is important, but one study found that there is no need for the time condition. Just the focusing on the form or the structure of the utterance can make up for this condition. The third hypothesis is which is natural order hypothesis. So it suggests that language elements are acquired in an essentially fixed, predetermined order. We talked about in first language acquisition that certain elements or morphemes are acquired in a certain order, like the ing, ed, and these things. So Kirsten said that there is a natural order also in L2. So L2 learners from different L1 backgrounds tended to acquire L2 primarily English. So English is the primary source of study. They acquire L2 morphemes in the same sequence. So like the L1 learners acquired the sequence, L2 learners acquire the language in the same in also a predetermined sequence. So like the plural s before the third, they acquire the plural s before the third person simple present s. So Christian said that there is a predetermined order, like this example, also in L2 learners. But as I said, all of them were criticized. So this one conflated accuracy order with acquisition order. So acquiring the morpheme is different from being accurate with it or using it accurately or in the right way. So he didn't differentiate between these two things. Also, cross-sectional studies were used rather than following one or several individual over time longitudinal. Let me explain this. So we have two types of studies, main types of studies, which is cross-sectional, or we call it دراسات أرضية, and longitudinal دراسات طولية. So the cross-sectional studies use different people or study different people, different learners with different levels of proficiency. So they are maybe a beginner, maybe advanced learners. So they are in different levels of the learning. And they study there's this phenomena in them. But they are actually not accurate because the level differs from them. Also, so the longitudinal studies are the opposite. They take the exact one learner and study his improvement or development through periods of time. So the longitudinal studies are more accurate. And longitudinal results didn't correspond to cross-sectional results on morpheme order. So when they created longitudinal result, they didn't correspond, they didn't come with the same results as the cross-sectional studies. Also, it failed to consider factors such as ease of articulation or mental processing requirements associated with using morphemes. So the morpheme ing actually is more easy or easier to pronounce more than the ed morpheme. Like saying talking is easier than saying talked. Like the ed morpheme is more hard to articulate or pronounce. So the natural order hypothesis didn't consider the factor like the ease of articulation. So sometimes how easy this morpheme is to pronounce affect the order of acquiring it. Then there's our fourth hypothesis, which is comprehensible input. It says that the most effective way to increase L2 competence is by exposure to comprehensible input. So what do we mean by comprehensible input? It's one level beyond the learner's current level. So if it's comprehensible inputs, so that we can understand it, so we need to be exposed to one level beyond our current level. But it was criticized because there is no way to determine the current level, and so therefore no way to calculate the vague level slightly beyond that current level. So I don't know at what level I am, so that I determine the next level that I should be exposed to. Also, the emphasis on input ignores any role for output, which is essential in the L2 learning process. So they focused very much on the input and ignored the output, which is also important in L2 learning process. Then our final hypothesis, which is affective filter hypothesis. It suggests that learners possess a mechanism or a filter, so that's the name affective filter, which under certain conditions could cause access to the language acquisition device to become blocked. So we talked about language acquisition device, or LAD, which is the mental organ in our brains that allow for language acquisition to occur. So Kirsten says that the access to language acquisition device sometimes become blocked. We can't access it under certain conditions. These conditions were primarily related to the learner's emotional state, such as high anxiety in search of learning context. So anxiety and emotional stress might cause the access to language acquisition device to become blocked. So he observed teenagers. So he said that teenagers tend to be self-conscious in front of their peers and therefore not likely to be receptive to language data. So when he observed teenagers, he said that they are very self-conscious in front of their peers and therefore they cannot receive the language data properly. So thus there is an affective filter that blocked their access to the language acquisition device. But it has one main criticism, which is the filter is too vaguely described to permit a clear way to test the existence of such an entity. So there is no clear description of this filter to determine whether this filter exists or not. So there's, as always, no evidence or no clear description. So it was also criticized. So we talked about 5 hypotheses by Stephen Krishnan, which is acquisition learning, monitor model, natural order, and comprehensible input, finally, affective filter hypothesis. Thank you for watching and see you again, inshallah, in our next video.